sound like a seasoned security professional. We continue our conversation with Malcolm Harkins regarding the topic. It's all about placement. It's like you may not reduce completely or avoid risk, but at least you'll know where your risk pinpoint is, and then you can add additional controls to monitor it, or you have additional eyes on the glass. So definitely. One thing that you mentioned in your response, and I kind of got curious, when you get information from Active Directory, let's say, will you be able to detect what many people call it toxic users in a company? To say, yes, this is a particular user has accumulated tons of rights to various systems and represents potential risk for somebody to use phishing attack and get in and get your crown jewels. Is it possible?
Yeah, with what we're ingesting from the identity systems, because we can see what not only their AD capabilities are, but those relationships. Again, a lot of people don't realize that there might be an aggregation of access, right? Because they haven't done an Active Directory analysis. They could have group permissions and or changes that all of a sudden create an identity exposure that they're not aware of. And it might not be the individual per se as an insider threat that's malicious, but because of that aggregated, elevated capability, the attacker would take advantage of that. Now, the other thing that's important to note about what we can do that, again, is very, very challenging for, if not impossible for most organizations, we can do these attack paths not only for the traditional IT environment, but the cloud environment, plus your OT environment, and the attack paths that connect between them. And so if you're, a multinational manufacturing environment and you've got, an OT environment over here, you've got your IT environment over there, and then some of your IT environments also spread into the cloud, we can show you those attack paths that exist between them all, which is also a highly valuable item for organizations. Or if in a medical situation, you might not have manufacturing environment, you might have hospitals, and you might have, what you think are reasonably locked down, mostly locked down, segmented capabilities, but devices and applications and identities cross those things. And understanding, again, that connective tissue between the different environments, the bad guys figure it out. We generally don't understand it. And if we do attempt to understand it, it's usually a highly manual task that's static. You invest, several red teamers and architects and folks like that to go think about doing an adversarial assessment. But 6 weeks later, 6 people later, hundreds of thousands of dollars if you paid an external consultant to do it, you get a portrait. But once you're done with it and you take those actions, there's no continuous updating. There's no continuous understanding of those contextual relationships and the attack paths as they change.
That's great. And Malcolm, I have a few more questions to ask. So one thing that I'm really curious, if any organization deploys your system, how quickly can they realize time to value? Because most system is like you deploy EDR, everyone thinks that immediate value because you have always attackers, and if you don't have it, but probably in reality it's not really immediate. It's the value until you find something really juicy and say, oh wow, check this out. If you didn't have the system, it would be completely owned by now. But in your case, it's a little bit, I would say, softer value to realize by deployment of your system, and how soon company can see it, and especially when they try to identify the paths and say, well, they have a bunch of control that are useless.
The deployment capability is relatively quick. We have, in essence, kind of a 7-day proof of concept process. A lapse time might take 7 days. It could take up to a couple of weeks. It really depends upon how long it takes you to hook up those APIs. And again, again, I'll take my Intel environment, or you can take a big environment. If you're trying to hook up Active Directory, you got to work through the Active Directory team and set that up. And that creates a little bit of an elapsed time. But let's just say, 7 days to 2 weeks, because you're pulling data from some of those systems and you're working through getting the permissions and set up. As soon as those things are set up and we're ingesting, in essence, we're building attack paths. So realistically, within a couple hours after that, we can start showing it to you. And I'll give you a couple examples. One, we had an early customer in a proof of concept stage back a few months ago, and they were partially hooked up after a couple days. Log4j hits, and we're on a call with them for the proof of concept. They spend the next day hooking up the rest of the data so that we can ingest it and get the full view of the enterprise. A couple hours later, we were able to pinpoint the 50 instances of Log4j that they really needed to give a crap about and go take action on that. They said they never would have been able to do that in that short of time. And if they had been able to do it through the guesswork and all the siloed systems and all the time, it would have taken them probably a week or so, and it would have taken several people's worth of time, and it would have been a guesstimate as to where they needed to focus their efforts to mitigate log. We were able to do it in a couple hours once it was all hooked up. We got a purchase order a couple weeks later because they were like, that was enough proof of value that they bought very, very quickly. Another customer, we're in an active proof of concept with them. Again, a couple days after getting the ingestion and stuff like that, getting the permissions, we were able to show them that they had almost, let's say, an untenable amount of permissions in Active Directory, considering the configurations across their environment, that created a set of conditions that would have been, by and large, trivial to exploit, and then have multiple material events across this organization, including ransomware, including intellectual property theft, including taking down production environments wholesale, because they didn't really understand how the AD configurations and group permissions were laid out that created that. So again, we were able to do that within a few hours after the hookups were done from their environment. So again, for us, it's proof of value is pretty quick. It really just comes down to getting the permissions, hooking up the APIs, and giving a few hours to a day for that ingestion to occur and the attack paths to build.
That's great, thank you. And you actually answered in one answer or second question that I had regarding of anecdotal evidence or cases that you have. So you described, and I assume this client that you were helping, or they were doing POC with Epiphany, they had all the tools in the world that they were using. It's not like somebody just bought EDR and they didn't have anything else, so they have probably complex environment that they had to go through.
These were, by almost all means, mature organizations, with tens of thousands of employees, thousands of IT professionals and hundreds of security folks, with, again, a full accoutrement of Active Directory type controls and monitoring capability, vulnerability scanners, sophisticated endpoint capabilities, sophisticated network capabilities, multi-factor authentication. They had all the traditional controls. And, so by and large, they had what would, if you were doing a maturity analysis for the cybersecurity framework, which I'm a fan of for NIST, or some other maturation scale, they would have been a 3.5 to 4-ish on a maturity scale. If you were to look from a SOC 2, they would have passed a SOC 2. If you looked at it from all these other compliance regimes, they would have passed because they had the lights blinking on the traditional controls and even advanced controls that one would expect. Yet they have these exploitable conditions in their environment that they weren't aware of.
Yep, and that's kind of one of the things that you highlighted threat actors don't really care about frameworks. They care how your secure controls placed and how to bypass them. So, and I'm glad that you were able to help this organization, and hopefully they appreciate it. What they discovered in POC. Hey, Malcolm, one question that I have, and I know you've been in the past associated with finances, and you were running a financial organization because before you became guru. How would you say your tool will help organization to potentially reduce or eliminate certain controls? Because everyone, what you just mentioned, if you need to pass SOC 2, you need to have certain set of controls in place. You pick
Yep.
up NIST framework, you need to have certain controls in place. But at the end of the day, the question remains, have I reduced the risk, or I just introduced a lot more tools that they do certain things for certain framework, but overall I may have just tons of money wasted right there. And so will you be able to have this conversation with your CFO head and say, well, I can give you some money back if you actually can discover all the paths that the trackers can take?
Yeah, well, I think in some cases you can eliminate controls. In one of the customer meetings, and I won't name the vendor tool because in some cases it is an adequate capability to mitigate some privileged access risk. But they had a false sense of control because they said, well, I have this compensating control called blah. Well, guess what? The attacker doesn't care about that. And if they own AD and they have these privileges, they're not going to go through that compensating control, right? So in that case, is it compensating control that's for show? It's a compensating control that knocks down some risk. You can, at least with our capability, start figuring out if that's a faux sense of control or useful, but again, given the context of the configurations, allowed for a bypass of that compensating control. The primary area where you're going to get economic benefit for us, I think, fits in two areas. One, let's just look at reducing material risk and material exposure. And all the wasted effort that we do because we don't understand the exploitability of our enterprise. Once I understand the exploitability of our enterprise and what actions I should take, where I should focus my SOC alert monitoring, all that, I've become more efficient and more effective. Now, how do I quantify that? Well, on the one hand, if I can say, here's the 50 instances of log4j, and I give it to you 3 hours after log4j is announced because your vulnerability scanner runs, and then all that, you've just saved a whole lot of what I'll say risk assessment, risk debate, risk bias dialogues, collecting data. And so you could say, well, that vulnerability prioritization gives me a substantial level of efficiency that then I'm not wasting all that manual effort and manual, argument time with everybody in the environment trying to guess where you should take action. That, again, if I put on my finance hat and if I look at, I had a SOC of 75 people, go back to my Intel days, SOC roughly that size several years ago, and all the other ancillary people who would be involved in that stuff, I go, well, do I need the next 10 SOC analysts? Do I need all of those business processes to do a rapid risk assessment, or can I pinpoint that to the SOC analyst and not waste all the other people's time? As soon as I start doing that, my long-term need for just more and more people starts tapering. And so I slow the growth of the total cost of my security operations. The other way to look at it is think of, again, what we do with outside consultants. Penetration testing, even internally, let alone penetration testing you might do externally. 50 to 60% of the time for figuring out where to go rattle the cages is administrative time. It's gathering data. It's figuring out where you might want to attack and how you might want to do it. Well, guess what? You don't need to do all that manual effort. You take the attack path that we have, and then you go run either through a BAST, breach and attack simulator, through a penetration testing as a service, or through a manual effort, the penetration test along the attack paths that that exist. Now, again, if I was hiring a consultant to go do that, let's say, again, look at even my last outside penetration test at Silence. It was a six-figure, several-week effort. Well, if I had all the attack paths mapped and I knew what was critical, well, guess what? Now I could shrink that by, instead of 6 weeks, probably make it 2 weeks, because there was 3 to 4 weeks of that entire effort that was all that administrative stuff. Right now, my outside consultant bill just went down. If I'm using internal teams to do it, again, I don't need to add 5 more penetration testers. The 5 that I've got are sufficient, because guess what? I just created 60% savings on their time for their work. So there's a bunch of different ways you can get real economic return from the bodies and manual efforts that we have in place. And like I said, in some cases, there could be some tool elimination or tool refinement that you could do, so that you're not having a false sense of control, that you think you've bought a compensating control, but we can prove that the attack path is irrelevant to that compensating control, in which case you can get rid of it.
Got it, got it. No, thank you, Malcolm, and definitely, and I guess the bottom line of it is it depends how people are using it and what they're trying to accomplish. So there is no magic silver bullet that somebody can say. It's like it helps you to understand your environment better. It helps you to understand what risks are and how to protect your crown jewel or in the system that you care for. But the rest you can figure it out where you can get economical benefits and what to replace.
Yep.
So one question I came up with, and in relationship right now we have this drive that everyone is jumping on the bandwagon for zero trust network, zero trust architecture, and everything is zero trust. Would Epiphany be able to assist in some way people on that journey, or companies on the journey, to say, yes, here's potentially what can be done, or if everything gets dispersed into smithereens and nobody is connected to anything, or, well, it's not going to happen, somebody is connected to something else. But if everything becomes zero trust, and how would somebody, to say, use the system to assist them in this journey and to get to zero trust and understand better whether they actually achieve zero trust, or they still have environment that so-called zero trust, but it has plenty of holes.
Yeah, great question. In fact, I was previewing a book on zero trust. George Finney, who's an amazing individual, is the CISO for Southern Methodist University. He's got a new book on zero trust that'll be coming out shortly, that I was reading a draft of last week and over a week or so ago, to give him some feedback. And one is a fantastic book, so you should look him up and read it when you get a chance. But my feedback to him was actually specifically around, as I was reading it, the thought of how I would, if I went back to a big company again, or even a small company, how I would use this to, in essence, validate zero trust. Because you go, zero trust means I don't trust things as they connect through. Okay, so, but the question becomes, does a trusted relationship exist in your environment that you don't know about? Well, we can show that because of the exploitable conditions in the attack paths. And then that question just becomes, did you implement zero trust and have it in most spots, but there's configurations in your environment where, again, you have to allow for the trust, otherwise you're gonna break something else in your environment. If that's the case, then that's a conscious decision that you haven't fully implemented it. But then again, like I said, conditions in our environment, context is constantly changing. So a lot of people, we have this tendency to set and forget, right? And what I learned a long time ago, and you might remember this from both my first book and my second book, My Irrefutable Laws of Information Security, the efficacy of control deteriorates with time. Why?
Yeah.
Because we're lazy and set and forget. And two, because threats and vulnerabilities and configurations and all that stuff constantly change. So unless you have an automatic capability that's continuously giving you context around all those conditions, as soon as you've implemented zero trust, you're going to fall out of those zero trust architectures. So you have to have something that gives you that continuous awareness to the attack paths, so that you can make sure that you continually configure, orient, protect, and control to adhere to the zero trust premise and principles.
Got it. Thank you, Malcolm. Definitely, I think that's the advantage many organizations can take by just looking at your tool and what it does and the capability it has. So I think that's pretty much, I ran out of all my questions, and you gave extremely well thought out, detailed responses to everything. And looking forward to having you again on Cyber Talk with Nikolay show, and much appreciated you coming on. Thank you very much, Malcolm. And I'd like to say thank you to our audience for staying with us and continue to dial in and listening to what we're providing. And again, my bottom line is we're stronger together. So keep tuning in, and thanks everyone. Until next time.
Thanks, Nikolay.
For more information, please go to our website at www.ISSQUAREDinc.com.